Thanks, Evelyn. We went one step further in the plain language work at Sun Life, and this work is continuing not just in our Canadian operations, but now in the US and in Asia as well. I had been working in the early stages of implementing plain language across the organization and talking to writers. And what was very clear from pretty much everyone I spoke to was that they understood the value of plain language. They were bought into its best practices and clearly saw why it was important in a financial services organization. But they struggled with a sense of what was the voice that I was asking them to write to. And Evelyn, if you could forward the slide for me. And that makes good sense when you think about your typical brand guideline and the very detailed direction that we give designers. The colors, the background colors, the various ways the logo should be presented, white space around the logo, fonts, and all the rest, page after page after page of direction. And yet when you look at what the writers are given, it's generally very high level. They're given a couple of brand attributes and instructed to align around those attributes as best they can. Go forward for me, please, Evelyn. But here's a great example of what existed in the previous version of the style guide at Sun. You may inject humor into your writing, but only where appropriate. Nobody knew what to do with this. And of course, in a financial services context, humor can actually be quite a dangerous thing to use. If you are being told that your claim has been denied, or you are in the midst of a major life event that is stressful for you, you're not looking for levity from your financial services organization. And so we need to be very, very careful about how we align to a tone of voice inside an insurance company. Go forward, please. There's an emerging understanding of the importance of this. I'm told that globally, about 1 in 10 financial institutions have done the work to develop a detailed brand tone of voice. Certainly Forrester recognizes it. This is from a recent report. Seeing voice as a significant paradigm shift for marketers around the world, and the importance of a voice strategy. If you don't do it now, you risk falling behind. You go forward, Evelyn, there's further recognition, Brand Quarterly, talking about how a brand voice isn't just about external communications, but it is about internal culture. It's about the employee's understanding of what the brand stands for, what the brand represents, and by extension, what is the brand experience that you're attempting to deliver. If you think about the importance of how organizations communicate with their customers in a consumer-empowered environment where expectations are set by the Amazons and the Googles of the world, the Apple, those types of organizations that provide the absolute top shelf customer experiences, they expect that of all of us. And so that's our challenge. And the way that our call center people talk to customers, the way in our B2B environments, our client service people talk to the people at the other end of the phone or in an email, critically important. And you want to manage that as carefully as you can. But of course, there are all kinds of objections to this. Leaders will very often in an organization describe their business as in some way unique, too complex, too technical for a tone of voice that is based on plain language best practices. We're also told that multiple lines of business can be a real issue. This was certainly the case at Sun Life, where 5 different business units just within the Canadian organization drove inconsistency, not just across media, but across the business lines. The existence of both B2B and B2C channels inside an organization, different distribution partners. We at Sun Life would be writing for employers one day, financial advisors another day, and then of course the end consumer still another group to take into consideration. So that kind of complexity and multiple groups, multiple audiences, if you will, how can you possibly come up with a tone of voice that works for all of them? Detailed processes. One of the real fascinating learnings as I started to implement this across the organization was how much writing got done from a process-oriented perspective. The power of the subject matter expert inside an organization really can't be understated. They very often, because they come with the technical knowledge, they very often dominate the discussions when it comes to the writing process. And so you do get a lot of materials that are properly representative of the process, but aren't really written from the consumer or the client's perspective, the audience that you're trying to reach. And of course, the age-old good writers are hard to find. So I've put together a step-by-step process that we followed and I would recommend to any organization. First is this definition of the brand voice. You want to get that brand positioning down to a few specific words. At Sun Life, we landed on caring, optimistic, and relevant. Now that was really powerful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it resonated in the research that we did with all of our client groups. It positioned Sun Life not as a traditional financial institution, but rather as an organization that genuinely wanted to do right by their people. Caring, not helpful, for example, caring being a more emotional term, wanting to give people a sense that we really did have that sense of caring in all of our work. But you can imagine from a writing perspective, caring, optimistic, and relevant were highly instructive for writers. So if they were writing a piece that denied a claim, for example, or denied coverage, they knew they had to dial up caring really high, and they had to dial up optimistic really high in the form of suggesting alternative products that the customer might consider. The second step that I would encourage you to think about is then build that tone of voice into your brand guidelines and get into as much complexity as you can. It's not going to be as long as the visual representation of the brand, but it certainly needs to be a lot longer than it probably is right now. And take advantage of the fact that if you do have multiple client groups or different distribution partners that you deal with, think about how you're writing for each of those groups. And that's the sort of granular detail that you can put into a brand guideline to help your writers align. A detailed writing guide is next. So this is a companion piece to the brand guidelines. This is an opportunity to re-emphasize the plain language best practices, the use of non-jargon language, obviously, the active versus the passive voice, and all the rest. You want to, what we found, we do a lot of business in different languages. We created ours in English first at Sun Life, and then we went to our partners in Quebec and worked with them on a French language version of the document. That ensured that we got it to an advanced stage that they could then take and not just translate for French-speaking customers, but rather give some thought to how to apply that positioning, that tone of voice, to the unique Quebec marketplace. The fourth step that I would recommend is you need an organizational-wide education plan. Big thing to understand is that virtually everybody in your organization is a writer. And so it's, I would encourage you to think about two levels. You got those who have writing in their job description. Those are your super users. You're going to want to create the right education plan for them. You want to work very closely then with all of those folks who are involved in approval of documents. If you're in a regulated industry, for example, you've probably got legal compliance, and sometimes in financial services, documents require tax review. Those experts need to be in on the discussions, need to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the outcome ought to look like. And then you want to be thinking about a third tier, which is the employee population at large. I would encourage anyone to look at the various writing analysis products that are out there. Absolutely, wholeheartedly agree with Jeff about the power of the metrics-based discussion. I had a great experience with one of our writers. They had written a very short message that was intended to communicate a change in pricing for compression stockings that diabetes patients use. And the piece of writing read, "The maximum reimbursable amount for compression stockings has changed." And so I encouraged the writer to have another crack at it. I thought that that could be presented in a more plain language way. And I was told a couple things. I was told, number one, Kevin, this has gone through multiple sets of hands. This has been reviewed and reviewed. We really feel that's plain language. And then the second thing I heard was, boy, that sentence exists in a lot of different kinds of documents. So I suggested that the sentence should read, "The amount we cover for compression stockings has changed." I felt that was simpler. Long story short, I ended up on the phone with this person's boss's boss, the vice president of something or other, who was telling me why this couldn't happen. But when I explained to her that what her team had written scored at a 12.8 and what I had written scored at a 7.6, the conversation was over and we got the outcome that we needed. Finally, I would encourage you to think about priority documents and really get the resourcing right. This is critically important. We found that by identifying about 1,000 documents, that this clearly signaled that this was a long-term program, that these rewrites were going to be ongoing. We're talking multiple years of work, but you just keep going. And so encourage leadership to provide you with the kind of resources necessary to get your documents into a state you want them to be in a timely manner. One quick other thing I wanted to share with you. As we were going through this rewrite process, we developed something that was quite radical for our organization and really encouraging. So this is the traditional publications review process. I'm sure you're all familiar with one version or another of this, where the piece starts with the writer up in the top left-hand corner. It then goes for a business input and approval. Legal signs off, compliance signs off, as I say, sometimes tax signs off, the brand people sign off, and then it goes back to the writer. The problem we were having with this process was that it was linear, that legal couldn't approve it until the business approved it, and compliance wouldn't even see it until legal had signed off and sent it along. And that was full of bottlenecks, as you can imagine, particularly with your legal and compliance folks who are often very, very busy. So we created what we called the review panel. And this was often done by conference call. What we did was we brought all of those folks together on the call for a real-time discussion about 2-3 documents at a time. The writer was there, the business representative, whatever subject matter experts we needed were on the call, as were the various other review partners. This was a game changer for us. What this meant was that we were bouncing ideas off of one another about how to get it right. So compliance would ask for a change, but invariably what compliance asked us to do was not in plain language. So as the brand person and brand tone of voice person in particular on the call, I would then take that input from compliance and I would work with the writer on making the change plain language. The thing is, though, we would do it all together while we were on the call. This got us to approval by the end of the call on those documents. The other thing it did, though, was that it taught everybody on the call a little bit more about the other priorities. So legal and compliance, the folks that we were working with on these calls, became some of our best advocates for plain language and our new tone of voice because they understood the perspective that we were working at. By the same token, the business leaders, the subject matter experts who are often making documents more complicated, were starting to hear why that was problematic, and they were being addressed in a respectful way. They were able to raise their concerns without being shot down or feeling like they weren't writers, so their perspective didn't matter. So these calls were, I would say, surprisingly even-keeled. Everyone involved seemed to appreciate them, and there were never any serious conflicts in it. And efficient. We were able to get documents to a much, much better place. It's a difficult thing to do to get this many people onto a call. It's not practical for all of those priority documents that you're going to identify, but it can be a very useful tool, particularly in the early stage of your program, to, as I say, get to consensus around what works for your clients and help with the education process.